Welcome everyone to the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. My name is Aliaksandr Lukashenka, and I'm thrilled to welcome everybody to talk about this important subject today, particularly our very distinguished group of panelists. It's very often the case that Belarus has been overlooked as a result of the war in Ukraine, also now the war in the Middle East. And so we're very happy to be able to bring the focus back to this important question and to talk about the state of affairs. Let me introduce the panelists so Karen doesn't have to. Christopher Smith, who is not at the end, almost at the end there, is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Eastern Europe and Policy and Regional Affairs at the U.S. Department of State and the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Oksana Shevel is an Associate Professor of Political Science at Tufts University and also, most importantly, a Center Associate and a Curie, the Humphrey Brinkley Research Institute. Ambassador George Kroll is a retired diplomat and adjunct professor at the Unis Naval War College. And Mr. Valery Kalineski is Deputy Head and Representative for Foreign Affairs in the United Transitional Cabinet of Belarus. I also have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Karen Donfrey, Dr. Karen Donfrey, Senior Fellow, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. I also want to thank the Belarusian Freedom Forum and the Belarusians of Boston, two Belarusian diaspora organizations that are working on helping their country from abroad. And they were co-organizers of this panel. And I hope that we're going to have a productive discussion, although let me make a few housekeeping announcements. One is that the event is being recorded and it's going to be available on the Davis Center YouTube channel. The second half of the event, after our panelists make some remarks, will be Q&A, so please get your good questions ready. And also, we invite you afterwards to join our reception that is going to be right outside there in the hall. So now we are lucky to have an introductory statement by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, and Laura is going to do it.
Dear friends, it's my pleasure to open such an important discussion about Belarus. Thank you, Dr. Donfrey, and all distinguished speakers for gathering today to share your expert views and advice. I'm deeply grateful to the Davis Center for launching this discussion on the American soil. Freedom and independence are in the DNA of your nation, and your view and your actions on these values matter. Since 1991, when Belarus restored its statehood, the US has pledged its commitment to Belarus' sovereignty, independence, and democratic choice. We live in such a dangerous situation now that this pledge has become completely relevant. We need to find ways to fully implement it. Indeed, the situation for Belarus is dire. Since the revolution of 2020, Belarusians live in fear. There are thousands of political prisoners, and this number is growing. Among them, journalists, civil society activists, human rights defenders, politicians. Many have been held incommunicado for more than a year. Among them, Nobel Peace Prize laureate Aliaksandr Lukashenka and my husband, Sergei Tikhanovsky. About 6% of Belarusians fled due to persecution for their political views. This would be more than 20 million people in the US. Free media and civil society have been outlawed and had to flee or go underground. The regime wants to eliminate every independent voice and witness to its crimes. The dictatorship has become a threat to peace and security to the entire region. Hijacking a commercial airplane to arrest a journalist, organizing a migration crisis on the border with the European Union, and finally enabling the war against Ukraine. Belarus has become a textbook case where human rights crimes and collapse of institutions lead to international conflicts. As a result, the Belarusian democratic movement is facing a twofold challenge. We must defeat a lawless dictatorship and protect our independence from Russian assault. Any such problem is extremely difficult, and Belarusians have both at once. And it is not an exaggeration to say that Russia is gradually annexing Belarus. This process started a long time ago. The Union State Treaty between Belarus and Russia, signed in 1999, became a roadmap to absorb Belarus. Since 2020, the pace of the so-called integration increased significantly. Putin helped Lukashenko stay in power, putting him in personal debt for which he pays with national sovereignty, our national identity, and our future. Russian subjugation covers Belarusian foreign policy, information space, economy, finances, national security. Armed forces are increasingly aligned. In violation of the constitution and international obligations of Belarus, Putin declared an intent to deploy nuclear weapons on our territory. They aggressively target Belarusian national identity by replacing our national narratives with the Ruski Mir ideology. In sum, Russia pursues the most harmful colonialist practices against our nation. Two observations in this regard. First, I often hear that this is normally up to states to decide on bilateral relations. But what is happening between Belarus and Russia is far from normal. It reminds more of a hostile takeover. Most importantly, this integration goes straight against the will of Belarusians, most often even beyond their knowledge. Second, the Kremlin views Belarus and Ukraine in the same light, but uses different methods to end our independence and to rebuild its empire. It is weapons in case of Ukraine. In case of Belarus, a corrupt, illegitimate, and power-addicted dictator who became a puppet of Russia's illegal ambitions. It is dangerous for Belarus. It is a threat to the entire region. Now you can ask why the world should bother, why the US should be involved. After all, the Belarusian regime, a distant phenomenon, is not the only dictatorship in the world. First, the Belarusian dictatorship is not an isolated case. Dictators watch and learn from each other, and they are on the rise. Authoritarians directly challenge democracies, seeking domination and control. The US is the leader of the free world, and this trend affects its vital interests. Second, Belarusian regime's role shouldn't be overlooked or downplayed. It is the threat to international order and global security. The usual suspects are directly involved: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Among these big names, Belarus is often lost, and the dictator evades the most serious consequences, but it does play a vital role. The regime is the only open ally of Russia in the aggression against Ukraine and contributes to the war effort. Lukashenko's model is Kremlin's success story. It fuels Putin's appetite for more control everywhere. However, there is a temptation to postpone the Belarusian crisis until later, when Ukraine wins and Russia changes. And this puts Belarusians in a long and uncertain waiting line. This view ignores the regional importance of our nation. However, it is my firm belief that a democratic Belarus can influence the entire neighborhood. At this point, I would like to outline our strategic vision of how Belarus' independence can be preserved and what kind of support it needed. First, we must be clear about the baseline. Belarus shouldn't be seen as a satellite state of Russia. It is a European nation, a nation of rich and unique history that has made massive contribution to the European civilization. A nation that aspires for its own future, where we are free to be ourselves. We celebrate our heroes and we speak our language. We want to return to the European family, where we historically belong. For us, it's about our shared values. It is about development prospects, and it is about security, to stay independent and Belarusian. To this end, we will pursue an EU membership when the conditions are right. Importantly, it would bring us closer to the transatlantic community, tying with the US, UK, and Canada. Second, the Belarusian democratic movement needs to be recognized as a legitimate political force. Despite extreme conditions, we have shown staying power, consistency, and focus. We are united and we evolve. We continue working on the ground, more carefully and secretly, but nevertheless, we operate, we inform, and we help. We are strengthening our agency, but we need to do more to deliver to Belarusians. Our movement is indispensable. We cannot be accused of interference in internal affairs of Belarus, because this is our country and our duty to rescue it. We are not asking others to do the most dangerous job. This is our responsibility as citizens to free our own country. But we need genuine support of our efforts, just like help for Ukrainians who are facing the same existential threat. Third, we need international action in restoring democracy as a path to preserving our independence. The only way for Belarus to preserve its independence is to leave the war before it ends. The only way to leave the war is by restoring democracy and resuming friendly relations with the West. Moreover, this would be the best way to help Ukraine win their fight. As we are looking for ways to help Ukraine, we cannot leave Belarus as an overlooked opportunity to make a strategic difference. Fourth, Russia must be called out and pushed back on its illegal actions to absorb Belarus. It is happening openly while the world is watching. Our allies should refuse to recognize agreements the illegitimate dictator signed with the Kremlin after 2020. The US can adopt now a policy of non-recognition of any attempts to absorb Belarus. The US has important record of such principled and bold steps, like when it happened in 1940, when Secretary Veles adopted his declaration about the annexation of the Baltic states, or in 2018, when the Crimea Declaration was adopted. Such a position adopted today would put Russia in the international spotlight and become a strong deterrent against its further steps. And finally, I ask to consider launching Belarusian studies in Harvard. Our region is often viewed through the prism of Kremlin interests. A clear understanding of our values, culture, national priorities would benefit decision-making and long-term relations of the US with Belarus. In conclusion, I would like to express my gratitude to the United States and to the American people for believing in Belarus' promise. Thank you for supporting our difficult path to democracy and independence. History of relations of our nations goes back for centuries. It is full of heroism and sacrifice during struggle for a noble cause and deep mutual respect. And I want us to reach that stage when we resume our dialogue as states that share common values and common interests. Thank you again for gathering today to talk about Belarus independence. I wish you a productive conversation. Together, we will prevail. Long live Belarus. God bless America.
Aliaksandr kicked off by noting that Belarus is often overlooked. And I think the Davis Center has outdone itself in bringing together the voices it has today to focus on the situation in Belarus. I can't think of a better beginning than hearing from Svetlana Tikhonovskaya. And I think we will reflect very much on her words as we have a discussion here at the table. I am going to be informal and refer to my amazing panelists by their first names, so I hope no one is offended by that. But I think we should start by unpacking the title of this session, The Other Annexation, Gradual Takeover of Belarus by Russia. We heard Svetlana Tikhonovskaya refer to this annexation as a hostile takeover. And Valerie, I wanted to start with you to ask, help us understand, we often talk about this as a soft annexation. What does this mean? And how does annexation look in this case of Belarus? So with you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you again for hosting and organizing this meeting. And thank you, the audience, for finding time to come here today. I understand that this is not the easiest time for students during the preparation for tests and exams, but the topic is actually highly relevant, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak about this today. This process of taking control over Belarus has started a long time ago, and Lukashenko actually ran on this in 1994. Unfortunately, we will have to mark 30 years of his rule exactly this year. And from the very beginning, his stake was always on finding support, finding benefits from Russia in order to strengthen his role. He's never been, or I would rather put it this way, he's always been skeptical and suspicious of democratic values, of democratic process, of something that kind of made democratic nations successful and strong around the world. He's a Soviet person by his mentality, by his upbringing, by his professional background. So he never understood what is happening in the West. That's why his choice was always pro-Russian. Moreover, he at some point during the early years of his presidency, he was aiming to come to Kremlin. That was possible politically, but Yeltsin very weak and nobody is on the horizon. Lukashenko was aiming to come to the Kremlin, and this is how he initiated the process of signing the Treaty on Union State. And that was his major miscalculation, because just 3 weeks after he signed the agreement, he signed the treaty, Yeltsin left. And Putin came, somebody who was ambitious, who believed in himself, was not an elected politician, but that destroyed the calculus of Lukashenko and made him actually kind of be on the defensive from Russia for a very long time. Interestingly, we raised the issue. Belarusian democratic forces, analysts, politicians raised the dangers of the Treaty of Union State with European and states, the United States, that this is actually a roadmap to absorb Belarus. But the response was always, this is bilateral relations. We cannot interfere in something like this because it opens a Pandora box. This might repeat in other places, and we cannot be part of this. But by now, what we are seeing is since 2020, Lukashenko has lost a lot of ground, a lot of political will to resist pressure from Russia, from the Kremlin, and he had to yield a lot of ground to them. In 2021, he had to sign a package of programs, integration programs, 28 of them, to synchronize activities in customs, in banking, in taxation, and they're being implemented as we speak. National defense, foreign policy, information field are fully under control of Russia. They can transmit their message, they can put Belarusians on the same wavelength as they want through their narratives, through the Russian Ruski Mir narratives. What's most concerning to us Belarusians now, that there's a very direct assault on national identity of Belarusians since 2020, when history textbooks are actually being rewritten and some national heroes are being thrown out of these textbooks. Now we have a history book on common history of Russia and Belarus, which has never happened before, even during Soviet times. And this is a direct assault on the core of the nation. This is the major factor that ensures our resistance to external threats like Russian interference in our affairs. This is what concerns us, and this, you can say that this is a soft annexation, but actually it goes to the very depth of the national state.
Thanks so much. Oksana, let me turn to you next, because the other side of the coin is Russia. How do you define Russia's objectives here, strategic, political, economic, and how do you see this moving forward from the Russian side?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I mean, being more of an expert on Ukraine than Belarus, I want to make some parallels as far as sort of what Russia is doing in Belarus that, have some parallels, but different outcome maybe with regard to Ukraine. And just picking up on the last point being made here about this identity and kind of writing history from a certain angle, right? When there is this, as Putin claims with regard to Ukraine also, that there is some sort of natural, God-given, like authentic commonality of interest and continuity of faith, right? Which makes it, again, it further strengthens his claim that, neither Ukraine nor Belarus deserve to be separate states and they really need to be in some sort of, common state with Russia. And for that, it's absolutely necessary to have this narrative of common identity, because if you have a narrative of distinct nations, then why should the nations be in one state, right? So this is really critical. And in Ukraine, I mean, I think it's important to emphasize that this, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened only in 22, right? And in the case of Belarus, we have this annexation, soft or hard. But this push against identity has been going from the Russian side since the early 90s. So that's not something that is really new. I mean, in Ukraine, there were attempts to have a common history textbook that failed. There was this all complaints from the top Russian leadership about Ukrainian politics of history, politics of identity, language policy, all of these things that sort of went against this narrative of continuity of faith and commonality of identities and nationhoods. So as far as, your question, sort of what is Russian objective there, I think they see these as related. So yes, they may have, some sort of hard interest in Belarus and like place weapons there, use it as a staging ground for assault, against Ukraine. But it's not sort of isolated. So I don't think we can separate it from this broader identity politics that really tries to, rewrite history from such a way that nobody would question. Including in the countries themselves. This is why we see, in Belarus, this rewriting of history textbooks, which in Ukraine failed, but it is going full scale in the occupied territory. They want to, quote unquote, re-educate the populations there, that they're really Russian. So I just sort of, for now, maybe end with this, that I think to keep in mind that, Russian objectives in Belarus, I don't think we can separate this sort of, harder objectives for placement of the military weapons, so forth, from this broader kind of conception that these nations, both Ukraine and Belarus, are not real nations. They're sort of part of this larger Russian supranation as Putin comes to think about it. Again, if we go deeper into post-Soviet period, there were different views about it on the Russian side also, especially in the 90s, but that's where things stand now. So I think whoever follows this annexation plans should be really paying attention to identity things and not just sort of security and economics angle of the annexation.
Thanks so much. Chris, let me bring you in here. First, share with us from the US policymakers' view, what is US policy toward Belarus today? And how does the situation in Ukraine affect the strategic calculus, maybe for Ukraine, but also for US policy?
Karen, thank you so much for the question and the opportunity to join the discussion today. We have had a decades-long policy of supporting Belarus as an independent state, as a nation that deserves to choose its own foreign policy future, as a country that is distinct from Russia. I think that is important from the perspective of principle, but it's also important from the perspective of hard interests. And I think one of the key lessons that I have tried to share with elevating the focus on Belarus is looking at why values and democracy matter in Europe. If Belarus had been allowed to develop into a democratic state, had there been a free and fair election in August 2020, there is simply no question that a democratic Belarus would never have allowed Russia to invade Ukraine from its territory. And if Russia had not been able to invade Ukraine from Belarusian territory, the whole concept of operations that defined Russia's military attack, namely this lightning strike on Kyiv, was only possible because they were able to invade from Belarus. Belarus has no natural reason to be an enemy of Ukraine. Simply, Lukashenko made this decision to preserve his own position in power. So it's a reminder to practitioners and academics alike that values, democracy, these things are important from a principle perspective, but they also matter because of hard security. So from our position, what we are trying to do with respect to Belarus is use this example to elevate the focus in Europe globally on why democracy in Belarus matters, because it has real implications for the United States, for NATO countries, and for the broader region. And we're doing this by elevating our interaction with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. I really appreciated her remarks today, opening up the panel. We held a strategic dialogue with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the members of the United Transitional Cabinet that was designed to tailor how US engagement, development assistance, strategic messaging is aligned to support their mission of creating a democratic and independent Belarus that cannot be used by Russia as an axis to attack Ukraine, and also measures that we're taking together with them to impose sanctions on the Lukashenko regime to prevent that from happening, but also to go after the sources of strength from which the Lukashenko regime derives its position and uses its instruments to attack democracy and human rights in Belarus.
Thanks so much. George, you served as U.S. ambassador to Belarus from 2003 to 2006. Looking back and considering where we are today, was this foreseeable? What has surprised you about these developments? Is Belarus the same place you thought you knew then?
Well, thank you, Karen, my colleagues, everything. I appreciate the Davis Center's and all the organizers for doing this, because if there's one thing I agree with is that there needs to be a lot more study of Belarus, which has been the unknown, ignored country of Europe by the United States. And I speak about this, I'm not a US diplomat anymore. I retired, but I was not only ambassador to Belarus from 2003 to 2006, I was in Belarus in our embassy when we established diplomatic relations with the Republic of Belarus in January of 1992. I was there when Aliaksandr Lukashenka was elected president in 1994. I was the charge d'affaires of our embassy there. I have a long history going back with the US government, and subsequently, I then traveled eastward to Central Asia afterwards. But one thing that has always struck me is that there has been such a lack of understanding of this country and its complex history, its complex geography. There's such a tendency, and it was in the United States government early on in the 1990s, that Belarus is an adjunct of Russia. And what bothers me a bit when I hear, I understand the concept of annexation, but that has a tendency to reinforce this sense that it's a takeover Russia. It's a Russia issue, or it's a Ukrainian issue, or it's a Lukashenko issue. This is really a Belarusian issue, and it's such a complicated place to be there. I traveled around that country. I learned its language, and you could see that it's a lot more complicated than the way it is often portrayed. And so, what I would have said in the 90s, and even when I was ambassador there, is that there was no real sustained focus on Belarus. It was when Lukashenko was elected, and the nuclear weapons removed, that was it, basically. And then it was sanctions and things like that, not to even, try to even see what is going on in this place. And then at the same time, when I was there, there was, treaty of friendship with Russia, then the Union Treaty, which again, at the time, there was a lot of, well, is this going to be annexation? Belarus is going to disappear from the map of Europe. Well, it didn't, and it probably won't. I had served even earlier in Poland when it was in the Warsaw Pact. And Poland was a country that was basically run by the Soviet Union. I was there when martial law was declared. And it would say, well, the Polish people didn't have a say in their government, much like the Belarusian people today don't. But there was an issue where, for the Soviet Union, and I think for the Russian Federation, of having a satellite state, a state that will be its most fervent ally. That is important to Russia, but also vote in the UN and the fact that it has all of the trappings of being an independent state, but closely aligned in foreign policy, military, and the like, as we see even today. I think there were so-called exercises with nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, whether they were or what, who knows if it's kabuki or whatever. But I would have to just say that there has to be a lot more attention given to what is going on there. And I'm very glad that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her people are trying to bring attention to this country, and also its, how it stands. I think in many respects, I met Lukashenko when he was first elected, and then I was, I didn't spend a lot of time with him when I was ambassador, but here is someone who Belarus and he are the same. And one thing I think in his own survival is the survival, oddly enough and ironically, of Belarus. And the fact that he has had times of bringing the Russians in, giving them what they want, and then, putting them at a distance, even arresting them and the like, just as he's done with the West, with the United States and Europe, pull them in so far, but the main thing is survival. And if there's one thing I would end with, is that one thing about Belarusians that I've admired about is they are survivors, all of them. They have learned to adapt. They have learned to endure. Fate has not been kind to them in history. It's a land that has been filled. Every place you would go, there's blood on the ground. But they've had peace so far, and my fear is, God forbid, if what happens in Ukraine happens in Belarus, because I think most Belarusians don't want that to happen. And so I think that it's a long-term project, and also having a long-term commitment to Belarus, to understanding it, and in ways that are deeper than the rhetoric that often we hear either Washington or Brussels and the like as well. It's a complicated place, but these people matter. They matter to themselves, and they believe in themselves. But these are people that have had a very long and complicated history, dismissed by so many of their neighbors, near and far, whether it's Poles, Lithuanians, even Ukraine, said, well, these people, are they really that? Do they have an identity? They have developed an identity of themselves. If you talk to and listen to a Belarusian, and they have different ideas of their own identity. So it's a matter of respecting them and understanding them and finding the ways to support them, the people in Belarus and all those that are outside of Belarus, as they continue this long effort of finding their own place in their own country in Europe. So my hat is off to people that are interested in this and to understand the complexity of it. There are no simple answers. And I frankly think, as all Belarusians, these are not sentimentalists. These are realists, and they're fatalists too, in my understanding of being with them. But what they are is they have learned the art of survival. God bless them.
Valeria, let me come back to you. The three panelists who spoke after you have sort of generated a question for me, which is, why is it that Belarus, unlike Ukraine or some other examples, has never had a successful democratic transition, or hasn't had a sustained pro-democracy movement since Lukashenko's election? Help us understand the internal dynamics.
Well, probably we can go back to history and see how the Belarusian nation was under a lot of stress during the times of beginning with Russian occupation in the end of 18th century. Belarusians were struggling a lot. They had several uprisings, which brought a lot of attention from Russians to us. Also would be called 1830 and then 1863 uprisings. The response from Russians was very tough, and they essentially outlawed everything Belarusian language, Belarusian education, Belarusian printing books. Meanwhile, let's say Ukrainians stayed a little bit outside of this process, and they managed to fly under the radar. And because also Ukraine was partially under Austro-Hungarian Empire, they had much better conditions for nation building. So this carried forward through the 20th century, when yes, Belarus was part of this process, when many nations across Europe established their sovereignty and independence, but it was short-lived because Russians came in forcefully and destroyed the Belarusian Popular Republic in 1918. And Belarus became part of the Soviet Empire with all the implications that we had, the Russification and the stress on Belarusian language. But still, even Soviet times, I would say that Belarusian language had much better prospects and conditions to develop than it is now under Lukashenko, who is doing his best to serve the Kremlin. but in 1990s, I think this all played out. The national identity, the national kind of self-identification in Ukraine and in the Baltic states, for example, was much stronger. And these movements helped to establish democracies that were oriented towards the West. And that's what made them a bit more successful, even though kind of in the case of Ukraine, there was a lot of drama and tragedy along the way. But interestingly, like I would separate this process of democratic developments of movements in Belarus before 2020 and after. Because for 30 years, we have been living under Lukashenko with, in very, very difficult conditions for democratic process to evolve. Since 2020, we are having a democratic movement that is very strong, that is evolving, that is vibrant, that is complicated. But nevertheless, we see that it is progressing and it's staying agile. What's interesting, this movement is headed by a non-professional politician, somebody who's never wanted to be a politician, who's never wanted, having an ambition to become a leader. I mean, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Before, there were several attempts to form the movement that would be more punchable, would be more impactful, and it didn't work out because of different factors. But still, kind of there's a ray of hope now. There's a lot of promise now with the movement that we're seeing at the moment. The conditions probably are more precarious than ever before, but at the same time, we have an asset that is rather powerful and promising.
Thanks. Oksana, when we think about how Russia has acted in the region, Russia claims spheres of influence. And then when there are democracy movements or pushback, then they blame the West for trying to influence and infiltrate their sphere of influence. And when we think about this, whether in Belarus, whether in Ukraine, in the region, what is cause and what is effect here?
Yeah, great question. I think there are sort of two interrelated components to this question, or to the answer to this question potentially. Because I think when Russia claims that pro-democracy movements in places like Ukraine or Belarus and elsewhere in the region are part of Western meddling, I think part of it comes from this kind of imperial lens that we talked about that Russia has towards these countries, right? That they're not sort of real countries, they can't possibly have this agency. Like, how could these people possibly by themselves like organize Maidan, organize this protest in Belarus? There has to be some sort of bigger brother there, right? Like, so it's part of it. But I think another part of it is also that it is really a threat to Putin's own authoritarian model. Because if you have a country like Ukraine or Belarus that are in very ways like, not that different from Russia, like, culturally, like there are commonalities, let's say more than was like the Baltic states, Hungary or Poland even for that matter, right? That potentially creates a dangerous precedent, right? So if you can have a democratic success in, our little brothers. So, like, could that create unwanted precedent for, and threatened by this way the Putin's authoritarian regime? So I think both of these parts are sort of, are there when we're talking about Russia's reaction to these things. But I would also say that, I think the democracy precedent argument was probably more kind of more prevalent or maybe more present in the earlier period, because given how Putin consolidated his rule and how he stamped, institutionally and in practice, all sorts of sources of opposition, be it from society, from the media, from the parties. So I think to say that he feared, Maidan precedent or 2020 protests. I mean, maybe my fellow panelists would disagree, but I would say like at the time of the Orange Revolution, that was maybe more of a fear because Putin's own regime was not as consolidated then. Than it is kind of, in the earlier period. But that said, I just wanted to follow up on the previous set of commentary. I think if we draw parallels with Ukraine and potential for regime change, one thing that it has been different in Belarus, but maybe as you said, may have changed after the 2020 protests, that if originally this sort of pro-Western, as Russia would call nationalist constituency, was quite a lot smaller in Belarus than in Ukraine. And in fact, there is a political science theory out there by my colleague Luke and Wei, some of you may be familiar. He actually attributes greater democratization or level of democracy in places like Ukraine and Moldova, as opposed to Russia and Belarus, exactly to these divisions in the national identity. And his argument is, which I think is interesting, it's certainly for the time period before the most recent years, that if you have this divide, then whoever is in opposition has popular base of support, right? In other words, like in Ukraine, this sort of east-west divide that was existed before Euromaidan, and it was admittedly very complex. We can certainly talk about it, it's a separate thing, but it did help sustain political competition because whoever was in opposition, like pro-Western or pro-Russian politician or political force, had this natural base of support. But that was not the story of Belarus, it was not the story of Russia, but it was also the story of Moldova. So that's sort of right. But now that if you have in Belarus, and again, I'm not an expert in Belarus, so certainly it was interesting for me to hear this, that this pro-democracy movement is not a minority anymore in that sense, right? So this sort of commitment to some kind of pro-Western European orientation and democratic political form of government after 2020 protests is basically much larger than it was before. And I think that is a cause for optimism because, again, as Tikhanovskaya is saying, it's an interesting question and we will get to talk about it. Can something happen in Belarus before Putin falls, right? And with its support for Lukashenka. But even when, some sort of political opening is created in Belarus, I think its prospects now are probably better than they were before. That's sort of my kind of, prediction, for lack of a better word, given how this dynamics worked in Ukraine in comparison to Belarus.
So Oksana, this point you made that fundamentally for Putin, democratic movements in any of these countries are a threat to his authoritarian model. And Chris, I want to come back to you to think about how that's playing out in the context of the war in Ukraine. We've seen Russia now deploy nuclear weapons in Belarus, reportedly. It seems that Lukashenko may be giving up his longstanding objection to a new Russian airbase in Belarus. How do you see Russia's strategic objectives in doing that? And what lessons do you as a US policymaker draw for?
Well, I think it's certainly clear and has been even more evident and perhaps more pronounced since August 2020 that Lukashenko is prepared to trade away Belarus's sovereignty and territorial integrity in order to preserve his own position. And I think, if we saw a creeping annexation in the sort of 20 years or so since independence or shortly thereafter, it dramatically accelerated after 2020 when Putin was able to gain and then use significant leverage. And as I articulated before, the most obvious example of this is the stationing of troops and then the invasion of Ukraine from Belarus's territory. In terms of how far this will go, part of the reason that we are targeting with sanctions, export controls, political engagement, other measures, Russia's ability to use Belarus as an axis to attack Ukraine is because we're looking for opportunities to try to separate out Belarus from this war. Very difficult to do, longer term objective. I'm not meaning to say that the measures we're taking are going to deliver that outcome in a short period, but we see that by creating that space, by trying to pull Belarus out of being an axis in this war, it helps to create a little bit of space for Belarus as something distinct, both from the war itself and from Russia's control. The challenge is that Lukashenko, as I said, is intent on trading away Belarus's position in order to maintain his own, trading away Belarus's future in order to guarantee his own. And so the challenge for us as policymakers, as diplomats, is to focus on trying to preserve some space while at the same time developing and expanding ties to the future of Belarus, which is not Lukashenko. The future of Belarus is Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, what her group represents, what the United Transitional Cabinet represents, which is the aspirations of the Belarusian people as they were demonstrated in August 2020, which is for an independent, sovereign future where they can choose their own alliances and geopolitical orientation. So we try to focus on both of those elements in our policy approach because it's critical both with respect to the immediate challenges in Ukraine and the immediate threats for the United States, for other NATO allies in the region, but also the longer term investment because this strategic moment will come. And when it comes, it's going to be very important that you have experienced civil society leaders who are ready to move forward and put Belarus on a different course.
Thanks, Georgia. I want to pull on two threads with you. One of the things we've been exploring is, of course, the situation in Belarus, but also what it's meant for the region. We focused on Ukraine, but you have such broad regional knowledge. And I'm curious if this example of Russia, Belarus, the Union State, how that's developing, are there implications of that for the South Caucasus, for Central Asia, for Moldova?
Well, yes, I think, again, if you're looking at the world from a Russian perspective, and I did serve in Russia, I served in Ukraine too, before I was even in Belarus. Is that their look at the world is the geography. Geography matters, and if you're sitting in Moscow and how you're brought up as a Russian, with your education, with your sense of history, and how you see the map, you see Ukraine, Belarus, you see the Caucasus and Central Asia. These are the boundaries. The Soviet boundaries are the boundaries of if it were the Russian state, and being able to control, if you want to call it, their sphere of influence is absolutely vital to their sense of security. Even if you would say, well, what fear do you have of NATO? That you look, there's China, there's Iran, there's Europe, the invasion routes that they learned about in their history, which is why it is an essential part of any Russian sort of sense of their own sense of security is ensuring that you have this control, whether it's by a satellite or not, of that territory, because they view the boundary of the Soviet Union in their mind. Now, this puts countries that emerged when the Soviet Union broke apart in this difficult position. Whether look, I was ambassador to Kazakhstan, and the Kazakhstani borders with the Russian Federation are 7,000 kilometers long, the longest, not guarded, not bordered, and and from a Russian perspective, that this is why Kazakhstan is very important to them, and they have troops there. They have a very close relationship. It's not the same as with Belarus, but not a union treaty, but the customs, the economic union, the military and security union as well. So this has been very important. We talk about Armenia as well, and Chris served in Armenia. Interesting that Russia allowed, if you will, the democratic election of Pashinyan in Armenia. Of course, the Armenians are now not very happy with Russia because of Russia's kind of moving to Azerbaijan. But nevertheless, this is being played out because the Armenians have no place else to go. They can't turn to the United States or Europe because geography matters. And similarly, I would say with Belarus, that it is very difficult that they have to manage a relationship with Russia, whatever happens in Belarus, because it's not going to go away, and the mindset's not going to go away. So it's very difficult also from an American perspective of how do you design a policy or that can prevent or change this when our own sort of effort, our own leverage in much of this is very limited. I mean, there are sanctions, but as we've seen, it hasn't had an immediate effect. Would it be long term? But if you look to the long term, which is probably the way to go, you never know what's going to happen either in Russia or Belarus or Ukraine for that matter, and how these things can develop that can allow opportunities for engagement. We have to go into it clear-eyed to realize that, yes, when you saw the demonstrations in 2020, it was kind of, oh my goodness, look at this, what's happening, could you believe it? And that was something that was developed over time in a sense of their own sense of agency in Belarus. But at the same time, you have to see who cracked down on it. These weren't Russian troops going in, these were Belarusians who, and they have a mechanism. Now it's almost on autopilot of how do you put down and ensure that you're not going to have another sort of uprising, again. And I think as long as this is kept in the Belarusians' own hands, Moscow will keep a certain distance as long as they know that at the end of the day, their ally is going to be their ally. So it's hard to say, again, what is going on within the Belarusian society of how the people who are part of the government. And of course, the government is supporting Lukashenko for the, as it were, and has interests in doing so. And certainly the security forces, these are tough nuts to crack, but also to understand. And I'm also concerned that we really don't have much of a sense of understanding what is going on there. We don't have a mission there. I mean, we have a building, but as far as Chris, I don't think we have any American diplomats serving there.
And visiting TD1.
Yeah, and everyone that probably one talked to is gone and left the country. But how do you know what is going on? And one thing I'd also add is that when you talk about your question of why democracy didn't sort of flourish in Belarus, I was there when they had a very good constitution. It was to be a parliamentary system, but with a weakened president. And it was lauded, in Europe and elsewhere that this was an excellent constitution, but they had no real experience in, what were didn't have parties in a sense. And you had a leader that emerged, Alexander Lukashenko, who, he was an uncanny, instinctive, intuitive politician, ruthless as a politician would be, and a Soviet one, as Oksana said, who could understand how you basically, defang the parliament, defang the opposition, bring this all under control, which was a way that they were teaching, frankly, the Russians how to do later. I mean, there was a certain sense that a lot of those people who were not, that were in Russia, who were Democrats or non-Democrats, the other side, found their way a refuge in Belarus because this was a sanctuary for them. And it's interesting that one says, well, Russia influences Belarus, but Belarus, strangely enough, influenced Russia in the means of how do you get rid of civil society and control it? How do you sort of end your, these voices that we're always raising about in Russia itself? That is something, in fact, the Belarusian government was quite proud of, that they were setting an example, unfortunately, of illiberalism that others were taking on because it was effective. And it still proves to be, unfortunately, effective in the sense of how civil society has been erased in Belarus. But as I said, Belarusians, and many are very adaptable and very smart of how to live under these regimes quite bravely. And so, I'm perhaps because I'm Slavic, I am not a great sentimentalist, but maybe we are. But I do think that survival is an art, and the Belarusians are excel by it.
So Valerie, I know you have a two-finger on this. I just want to give Chris a chance to respond to this point about how do folks in the US administration know what's happening in Belarus? Obviously, you're making the best out of a difficult situation, but do you feel that you are able to get enough information to understand what's happening on the ground, even to assess how effective the sanctions we're putting in place are? Just want to give you a chance for.
Yeah, and it's actually a challenge that we've faced for many years in Belarus, because even when we had an embassy, the Lukashenko regime put very strict restrictions on the number of Americans we could have working on that embassy compound. And so it limited the number of people we could have at any given time, the amount of time they could spend on the ground. It is a challenge. There is no question that embassies are incredibly valuable instruments to understand what's happening, to shape forces on the ground, and to advise Washington on where there are challenges and opportunities. We don't have that without an embassy there. And so we have to rely on contacts. We do have diplomats who go and visit and have interactions there when they're on the ground, but they don't stay. and it is a challenge that we have to deal with. We do, however, believe that we have other instruments to use to assess the impact of the measures that we take. We do maintain a dialogue, of course, with the regime at basic levels to communicate and maintain basic diplomatic interaction. But we have a very deep and broad series of relationships throughout the democratic opposition in exile, who themselves have very close relationships with civil society and other community actors all across the country. And that is very valuable to us in terms of assessing both where we see opportunities and also assessing the impact of the measures that we're taking as an actor involved in the situation.
That was a perfect setup for that.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on some of the points that Lester made previously. That Lukashenko's Belarus has become actually a perfect model for Putin. A country that is conduit of its interests, ambitions, conduit of Ruski Mir narratives, that has become actually an instrument for foreign policy adventures of Putin. And this model actually is a bad signal to all other neighbors of Russia, because this is what Russia would like to implement in other states as well. So using this precedent, using this model, Putin is trying to put pressure, and we see that these signals are being sent also to Caucasus countries, to Central Asian countries, and at the same time, Ukraine, that wanted to establish itself as a model of a European, democratic, sovereign, free state, was bad news to Putin. And this is why Putin and Lukashenko came down against Ukraine. So this development that they started the war against Ukraine was actually in some way unavoidable, because they had to really get rid of Ukraine that is a threat by their own existence, by this model of a democratic European state. It was a threat to Lukashenko and Putin. So to me, it seems that it was inevitable that they would try to eliminate it, to sort of take it under control. Also, there's this sort of Slavic family affair, so to say, because these are three sisters in the thinking of Lukashenko and Putin, because Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus are three sisters. And there's like, okay, this is our deal here, and we have to resolve it in the family. One of us have become a bit too uncontrolled, and we need to bring Ukraine back into the family in a very bad way, through domestic abuse, so to say. But it seems that this model thinking is prevalent also in Putin and Lukashenko. They would not want to have Ukraine go its own way, but at the same time, Lukashenko represents himself as a perfect model for Putin.
So you obviously have deep and broad contacts in Belarus still today. And I'm curious, what is your sense of what spectrum of the Belarusian public actually supports what Lukashenko is doing? Do they see economic benefits from it? Do they think they don't have a choice? How do you gauge public opinion on this, A? And B, do you see any divergence among Lukashenko loyalists? Is there any sense that there could be unhappiness in his camp? Just curious what your sense is.
I would say it's always been a case that Lukashenko would not get more than 30% of the vote. So this is his core base that he rely on. But at the same time, when we speak about relations with Russia, only 3 to 4% of Belarusians would think that this would be a good idea to merge with Russia. So the rest of the population think that Belarus needs to stay independent. So I'm not sure about the numbers in Ukraine, for example, but this is quite solid. You can say that Belarusians want to be independent, and they, for example, 54% now express their concerns that we have bad relations with the West, the state of the Republic of Belarus, and would like to see about 57% would like to see closer relations with the European Union in particular, seeing this as a normal way to develop relations with the outer world. The elites in Belarus are very concerned about this closer integration with Russia because they understand when Russians come, they have no place there. Because Russians will come with their own army of associates, of partners, families, business interests, and the elites in Belarus, no matter how close they are to Lukashenko, when he goes, they will go as well, and Russians will replace him completely. So there's this sentiment on the sort of basic level. Kind of ordinary people, they look at this also with a lot of concern because you can only imagine like what people lived through since 2020. First, there was this ray of hope, this very inspirational protest, and people wanting to be living in a free state. And then the massive crackdown, repressions, the outflow of hundreds of thousands of Belarusians, then the hijacking of airplane, the migration crisis, this kind of thousands of people from Middle East coming into your cities and being there for no particular reason. Then the invasion of Ukraine, the aggression of against a very close nation to us in so many respects. The deployment of nuclear weapons on our territory, the deployment of Wagnerites, the Gradual group is coming. So there's like a whole series of really, really bad news to us, something unthinkable happening to the Belarusian society on a regular basis. And so people are very agitated, and they also are very kind of tired of this endless streak of bad news. Kind of people want to be left alone, kind of they want to live normal lives, which is impossible to do it at the moment because there's too much of Russian interest.
Okay, everybody get your questions ready because I'm doing one last lightning round of questions and then we're coming to you. I'm going to put 2 questions out. You don't have to answer both. You can pick one, you can do both, but it's going to be quick. One is, what would be the most important steps the United States or Europe, the European Union, we haven't talked much about Europe, could take to support Belarus's long-term democratic prospects and or best case, worst case scenario for Belarus? And George, we'll start with you and we'll just go down the table.
Well, I think one thing that the United States and I think Europe can do is basically try to take down the barriers that they themselves put up on Belarusians to travel outside of Belarus and to treat them when they're in their countries. You know, if it was up to me, I mean, I know immigration is policy in the United States. It's very political and everything, but if you get every Belarusian that would ever come here, they can get a green card or whatever, saying the same for the European Union. I understand, and Belarus, you know, please tell me if they're wrong, but I think it's getting more difficult for Belarusians in even Lithuania and Poland and elsewhere of getting their status, because also the Belarusian government said, well, we're not going to renew your passports unless you come to Belarus. So what do you do with them? And I think there is an issue with the European Union, the United States. You know, there was much made of the, you know, of the plane, the Ryanair plane that came down. But as a result of that, you know, Belavia, the Belarusian, has been denied, you know, travel, you know, flight rights into Belarus. And I think I don't even know how anyone gets into Belarus these days or out of it. The trains, I think, at least under COVID, were stopped. I don't know if they've resumed, have they? No. So, you know, you're isolating a country and its people. And I think that that's something that could change. And maybe the Belarusian regime wouldn't mind, you know, in letting people leave and they could study, they could see the world, because that was one thing that was open for many Belarusians, was this access to an outside world. So if there's one thing I would suggest.
Okay, great. Oksana.
Maybe I'll take the best worst case.
Okay, excellent
question. I mean, in a way, it's sort of flip side of the same coin. I mean, I would say that probably the best scenario is Russian defeat in Ukraine, and the worst scenario is Russian victory. Because if you have Russian defeat, we can sort of discuss what that means. But basically, you know that Putin is shown that this imperialist aggression did not pay off, right? And then he or whoever comes after him kind of more turns inwards. I think that opens a political space in Belarus for all of these societal forces to be, you know, to become kind of regenerated. And more importantly, I think the regime cannot reliably rely on Russian backing, right? And that, again, that doesn't guarantee a democratic transition, but at least I would say hypothetically opens the possibility for, you know, either split in the elite or, you know, Lukashenko being replaced by somebody, or free elections where say, that there would be, and then at that point, especially if there is vested support for Belarus, and the incentives are kind of with the democratic alternative, that's one possibility. And of course, if that doesn't happen, if, say Putin somehow prevails, or at least is not decisively defeated, then I think this process we're talking about now, this annexation, will only continue, right? Because Lukashenko cornered himself exactly because of his anti-democratic policy, that he cannot sort of this maneuver between Russia and the West, because he basically is a pariah in the West. So as several panelists said, for him to stay in power, he has to give Russia what it wants, because they are the source of support, economic support, political support. So that's in a way kind of worst case scenario, because then yes, there could be support for opposition in the West, there could be alert to human rights violations, but as far as sort of something changing in Belarus internally, that seems quite a long shot to my mind.
Okay, super, Chris.
I would echo many of Oksana's comments about the best worst case scenario. I mean, what is true is that this full scale invasion of Ukraine has unleashed the forces of history, and it will either create opportunities that transform Eastern Europe, from which Belarus, and we need to be sure that we are ready to help them together with Europe, meet those opportunities and seize that potential to really integrate firmly and finally with Europe as an independent state. Or it is not going to work out, and the implications for Belarus are dire. I mean, effectively, it will be consumed by Russia. So I think that's your best worst case scenario. And the thing the United States needs to be doing now is investing to make sure we have the resources, the contacts, and the relationships necessary to seize that opportunity when it comes, a positive opportunity.
Super. And last but not least.
Thank you, Aaron. So I would try to respond to both. So first, we are witnessing a very tough geopolitical competition for Belarus, in which only one player is active now, and this is Russia. And so I would like to see that Western countries actually engage in this competition as well. Yes, we see a lot of support, a lot of moral support, material support, diplomatic support, but to be truly interested in turning this tide around and not allowing Russians to have free space and to have free range with themselves, because until now they sense that they can do whatever they want in Belarus and they will go unchecked. So we need to stop this. I suppose one of the kind of standard questions or solutions that we would hear, like, West needs strategy on Belarus. This is not an easy task, and kind of we can say that this strategy thing is very tricky. But I would suppose that a resolve to respect the Belarusian choice, the choice of Belarusian people to be European, to be democratic, should be there. And this would drive the thinking, the strategy, and the vision of Belarus as an actually a European democratic free state. So for the second question, best case, worst case scenario, I think the best one is to leave the war as soon as possible without waiting when it ends. This would secure our independence, preserve our independence, but also help us help Ukraine and Russia as well. I think this success of democratic Belarus could resonate in Russia as well. Going back to 2020, I remember how well it was taken by the Russian side, the protests in Belarus, that were like really inspiring in so many respects. It would resonate quite well around Russians. And the worst case scenario is probably wait until the war ends, and then we all believe that Ukraine wins the war, and then Russians probably would change somehow. Who knows? But this means that we have to wait for a very long time, and this is very uncertain. When the war ends, when Russians change, and when we have an opening for Belarus as well.
Super. And now over to you. Who has a question?
I think we have microphones also.
Okay. Well, okay. So
Microphone people are.
Well, you know what, while we're looking for that, let's start with you two. I want to take two at a time, but just project, and if we can't hear you, we'll let you know.
All right, let's pick up. My name is Mars Andras. I'm from Latvia. Europe is the scholar Center. Again, it's somewhat similar to the previous question. So would you have? Yes.
Yes.
Well, we're practical question. What kind of recommendations would you have for the Baltic states, immediate neighbors? Because obviously they have done a lot, the housing acquisition, but you know, it's very difficult to influence anything in Belarus. So we have very practical things that we should do differently.
Right, and just pass it to your table rundown.
Okay, thank you for this great panel. My name is Chang Po, I'm from Taiwan, and I think one of the point that this panel has made that really inspires me is that you mentioned how authoritarian regimes learn from each other. And this sort of gives me this question that, but do you see that the civil societies on both sides in Russia and in Belarus that learn from each other to how to resist from these authoritarian regimes? How do they cooperate and empower each other? And because it seems that since Lukashenko was elected in 1994, so it seems that for Belarusian civil society, they have this much narrow windows for liberty and freedom, and especially for their journalists to form their cooperation and their resistance. So, could you tell us about the dynamics?
Do you want more now, or do you want to just take those?
Oh, you had one too? Well, okay, pile on and then and everyone doesn't have to answer everything, so please.
My mother's parents were both from Ukraine, although they met and married in New York City. And my mother said that they used to say that they were from once Poland, now Russia. And so my question is, what determined the dividing line, since some of Poland did remain Poland? And what made the dividing line? Was it a result of World War I, for example? Thank you.
So who wants to take which question?
I'm happy to take the question with respect to the Baltics. I mean, the Baltic countries, including Latvia, are principled allies of the United States in how we approach the question of Belarus. So I think they have had a very active and constructive foreign policy, which has been important for driving opinion inside the European Union, both on strategically how to address the questions and challenges from Belarus, but also on the measures that are necessary to be taken, whether it is providing refuge for Belarusians who are trying to escape the regime, or coordinating sanctions policy and other steps and strategic policy with Washington. So the Baltics are really key actors in this approach. I think one challenge that is not unique just for Belarusians who've sought refuge in the Baltic countries or more broadly in Eastern Europe is the strategic patience that Baltic citizens have to continue to support large numbers of refugees. I mean, this is really critical. You all are keeping the flame alive for so many in Belarus, in Ukraine, and those who have sought refuge outside of those countries. It's really critically important that the Baltic countries continue to play that role.
Can I focus on the, actually, I wanted to comment on the Baltic one as well. Okay. I have sort of like maybe kind of unusual suggestion, but I think in light of, you know, what was discussed at this panel, this brainwashing, for lack of a better word, in the identity construction project that Russia invests very heavily in, right? Like that seems kind of like a soft issue, it's not hard security. But I think this is also where the Baltic countries, especially given, I think in Vilnius, right, isn't there is like a free Belarusian university, right? Mm-hmm. To have actually discussion of history without this, you know, Russian lens. Because it cannot be done in Belarus anymore, right? Like, so who is going? And again, it doesn't have to be some sort of like brainwashing, the alternative version of sort of Russian simplified, very simplified take on history, but exactly the kind of things that Russians don't want to talk about. They don't want to think about, you know, said heroes that are being silenced, you know, say history of the Russian political complexity of Belarusian society. You know, so I would actually say that, you know, this is something that Baltic governments could put like real money in, because Russia puts real money into this. You could have, you know, TV programs, you could have some sort of YouTube channels, you could have history, a history textbook of, alternative free Belarusian university version, right, or something like that. So that would be my kind of, just throw it out on the table, something to think about if you have the ear of the Baltic politicians.
I would definitely echo all the praise for the Baltic states. Kind of you're punching way above the weight. This is probably stereotypical, but still, kind of two of three are neighbors of Belarus. They also carry Latvia and Lithuania. They carry a lot of burden because of the threats, the challenges, the dangers that Lukashenko's regime is carrying. So kudos to you all and Estonia as well. We've received a lot of support in many different dimensions, and we definitely appreciate it and want this to continue. I will answer also the second and third question. Yes, we see a lot of conversation between civil societies of Belarus and Russia. There are some commonalities, but at the same time, the stories are very different. Like even basic terms, Russian society is pro-war somehow. Kind of majority of Russians are not against the war. Maybe many of them do not want to participate in the war, but generally they support the war against Ukraine. This is not the case in Belarus. So our society looks at this very differently. And this is probably why Belarusian democracy, not probably, this is exactly why Belarusian armed forces are not participating in this war, because society would not tolerate this, and this would bring in some turmoil in Belarus that could spill over into Russia. When we speak about the cooperation between political forces of Belarus and Russia, this is also a complicated story because until now we have not seen a very clear kind of unified message from Russian political forces that Russia of the future will abandon these imperialistic policies to look at neighboring states as their own realm that they have to take control over. We have not seen it so far. It is decentralized. This movement, Russian democratic movement, is decentralized. There is no one unifying voice. But this is crucial for us to hear this message, that there will not be such a foreign policy of Russia towards its neighbors as we see now. Now, with regard to Kobrin, this is a Belarusian city, of course, on Belarusian territory. The borders were shifting, kind of in general. In Europe, you can say that borders were shifting a little. But this has always been a Belarusian territory, and kind of it could be sometimes Soviet Union. This is inertia probably of some kind, but Soviet Union could be called Russia. Regardless, whether it was Ukraine or Belarus or Baltic states, it could be called like this. But I think after World War I, there was this Kherson line that identified the border between Poland and Belarus.
I would just briefly say that I've been in Kobrin, but this is a thing of history too. If you talk to Polish historians, they would say, well, this is traditionally Polish territory. Now, it was all part of the Russian Empire when Poland was basically absorbed by the Russian Empire and the like too. But it is and has been a bone of contention somewhat because of this, of this dual history. I mean, Poland's great poet Mickiewicz, his birthplace is Nowa Huta, which is in Belarus. Nowa Huta was also the capital of the Lithuanian, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania at one time. And there's always been this kind of, when you talk about the Baltic, Lithuania and Belarus as their nationalists have been sparring over who really is the inheritor of this. In fact, the first Belarusian coat of arms was the same as the Lithuanian. They have the Pahonia, which is this horseman on there. The only difference was the Belarusian's tail was down and the Lithuanians was up. If you know anything about horses, you know what the horse that has the tail up is doing. So this somewhat of, but again, history creates these frictions too. And I know that in Belarus, it was like, Kosciuszko, who's a hero in the United States, and Poland was born in what is Belarus. We preserved and built up his birthplace, which is not far from Kobrin and the like. And when I went to Poland as the ambassador of Belarus and was in the foreign ministry, there was a portrait of Kosciuszko. And I said, Tadeusz Kosciuszko, that great Belarusian hero. They're about ready to throw me out of the room. So, you know, history is difficult. And if you're Jewish, it's even more difficult because of that overlay and then what happened there as well. Civil society, what I'd say, what was interesting for me when I was there and also observing this is that in Belarus, and I think even in Russia when I was there, the civil society was never, they would fight with each other as much. And that was something that was some of them were infiltrated and they wouldn't agree. And again, maybe this is democracy too, but they would fight over grants, fight over this, and that weakened them, as a force. I mean, one would say even opposition movements, there are personalities, there are people that don't like it, there are people that may be used to be a destructive force in them. But that's something that has to be kept in mind when you're talking about, it's not a, one monolith as well. And for the Baltic states, they have done so much, but also they have provided past alternatives, certainly for transportation routes. The port of Klaipėda was very important for Belarus, not to have to depend on the other way. And the same for Latvia. And I know Latvia in particular in Lithuania were very keen on trying to develop those channels as giving Belarus and its economy other avenues that whether that could be restored under the terms of sanctions, it seems to be impossible now in the sense of the war. But again, there's a role to play, and I think the support that they could continue to give to welcome the Belarusians that are in their countries, and give them all the rights to live there, I think is the best thing they could do at this time. Thanks.
And we are now very close to the end of this session, but I'm not sure you're tracking. We also have had an online audience. And so we did want to try to give everybody who was watching online the opportunity to ask a question or two, which means you four are going to have to be very disciplined. So one is from Anastasia. How would you assess the latest developments in Georgia with the Russian-style legislation and suppression of protests? Are there any parallels with Belarus of 2020? And then second question, Alexius asks, in the West, meaning I think here, Belarusians are considered to be complacent in terms of the invasion of Ukraine. But I want to remind our Western friends that the life in Belarus for most people is more like surviving. What impact has this had on those trying to build democracy and freedom in Belarus? So
I'm happy to take the second question, and it speaks to what Ambassador Kroll mentioned as well, with this concept of surviving in an extremely, arguably the most deadly area on earth, particularly when you think of the 20th century. But I don't see Belarusians as being complacent in viewing Putin's war against Ukraine and the role that Lukashenko has played as a force multiplier for that war. There are hundreds of Belarusians in the Ukrainian army who have volunteered and joined to fight against Russia in eastern and southern Ukraine. That is a really interesting development and something to think about the implications of that looking forward, and how those volunteers view their own country's future trajectory as linked to the outcome of this war and their willingness to go and actually campaign and fight. And I think all of our indications are very similar to what Valeria has said, that the vast majority of Belarusians are totally opposed to this war against a neighbor with whom they never have had major issues and have always enjoyed strong relationships. And so I think this is a more complex question, just as the questioner makes clear, and it's something that we in the State Department are paying very close attention to.
Valeria, did you want to comment on that question?
Definitely don't feel that we're complacent. Of course, the regime is working really, really hard to destroy any remnants of the democratic protest and movement that we have seen so far, to the point that even the notion, the understanding of solidarity is being outlawed right now. This is one of the basic and most noble manifestation of human character. to help each other in times of need, to people who really need help. And this is criminal now in Belarus, which shows that regime is very concerned until now about the state of affairs in the society. They said that Belarusians are against the regime. They want democratic change, but they are trying to suppress it, to destroy it in any way possible, even going that low as to punish people who are trying to help others. So this is a very tough environment. This is an attempt to build a totalitarian state in Belarus now, which is built around the counter personality of Lukashenko, and this is dangerous to all. So, kind of regardless of how it is reflected on Belarusians, I think it is a potential danger to our European neighbors, to the transatlantic community, and it has to be stopped.
I'll just make a couple of comments on the question about Georgia, the protests in Georgia. I think it's really interesting because we have this sort of three precedents there. We have Ukraine, Belarus, and now Georgia, right? And in Ukraine, of course, the outcome was that there was an attempt by the government to take the country in the most authoritarian and pro-Russian direction, and it fails. Then in Belarus, that same attempt succeeds because government crushes the protests. And sort of now the question is kind of like, where does Georgia fit in? And I would make just 2 points here. First one, I think, if one were to make sort of a prediction, I think Georgia has a better chance of succeeding than Belarus did, not only because the protests are pretty massive and civil society is pro-Western, arguably to a greater extent than in Belarus, but very importantly, there is no consolidated authoritarianism in Georgia, and there is an opposition in the parliament that sort of offers institutional, there's in other words, institutional possibility for change, peaceful change in the regime trajectory and sets of policies. They could decide not to adopt this law. Elections are coming in the fall, if I'm remembering correctly. And again, this Georgian dream that had a majority support, but they were at the previous round campaigning on kind of more like pro-European, sort of they were not clearly pro-Russian. Now it seems like they're pro-Russian till they may well be punished in the elections, and then they sort of would have again, hypothetically, a more pro-democratic and pro-Western government. Then, of course, the question is, how would Russia react, right? Like, would there be a renewed round of aggression against Georgia? We don't know that. But in Belarus, it's sort of harder. So I think exactly because in part, because there is no institutional opposition in the parliament, just like in Russia, there isn't, which makes it much more difficult to have some sort of, peaceful change. Like what needs to happen, right? Like in Ukraine, pro-presidential party split, Yanukovych party split, and then they voted all of these changes, removing him from office, scheduling new elections and so forth. And that also could happen in Georgia, but there isn't, in Belarus, like that would be more volatile because there isn't this institutional comparability with the opposition having a strong presence in the parliament. But that said, I think if Georgia does succeed, I would say it would be a positive thing for Belarus because again, it will show the precedent that yes, this can be done, that this pro-Russian authoritarianism doesn't always wins the day. So, in that sense, I think as we watch events in Georgia, there are implications for Belarus as well.
Last word to George.
Well, I don't have as much contact with people in Belarus that I used to in the like, but to the extent that one does, the sense of sympathy for Ukrainians and understanding of what is going on there. Many of them, many Belarusians have had relatives and the like, maybe not as many as Russians do because there weren't a large number of Ukrainians. But along that southern border, there was, even though it's very marshy and things of that nature as well, there are contacts that go on. But I think under the circumstances that Belarusians live under, it's very difficult to raise your head up above to provide that the kind of moral support like when they feel so restricted by their own government in their ability to even interact with Ukrainians. But it is a major problem because they don't want to end up like the Ukrainians have, and that would be one thing that it's the God forbid that they would endure what they know their neighbors next door are going through.
And now Aliaksandr is going to close us out.
Yes, I'm closing you out by asking everyone to join me in thanking this very erudite and well-spoken panel. Thank you. To give a quick shout out to all of the weaker students